Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Pariyantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Om. Om. Om Parameshwaram.
Seconds were a bit glitchy, they were all off just now.
So okay, thank you. All right. Good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Nice to see you all this morning. Welcome to you. We begin our study of chapter 12 today. Welcome also to all of our students watching online. I'll give a proper introduction to the chapter in just a few moments. Why don't we begin, as always, with some recitation. And as always, be sure that you read the meaning while I'm chanting, and then repeat after me. Arjuna Uvacha, Arjuna Uvacha. Something happened here. There we go. Oops. Evam satata yuktaye, evam satata yuktaye, bhaktas tvam paryupasate, bhaktas tvam paryupasate, ye chapyaksharam avyaktam, ye chapyaksharam avyaktam, tesham ke yoga vittamaha, tesham ke yoga vittamaha. Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, Shri Bhagavanu Vacha, maya veshyamano ye mam, maya veshyamano ye mam, nitya yukta upasate, nitya yukta Shraddhaya parayopetaha, Shraddhaya parayopetaha, te me yukta tamamataha, te me yukta mataha, ye tvaksharama nirdeshyam, ye tvaksharama nirdeshyam, avyaktam paryupasate, avyaktam paryupasate, sarvatra gamachintyam cha, sarvatra gamachintyam cha, kutasthamachalam dhruvam, kutasthamachalam dhruvam, sanniyam yendriya gramam, samniyam yendriya gramam, sarvatra samabuddhayaha, sarvatra samabuddhayaha, ye prapnuvanti mam eva, te prapnuvanti mam eva, sarvabhuta hite rataha, sarvabhuta hite rataha, kleshodhikaratas tesham, kleshodhikaratas te, avyakta sakta chetasam, avyakta sakta chetasam, avyakta hi gatir dukkam, avyakta hi gatir dukkam, dehavadbhiravapyate, dehavadbhiravapyate, ye tu sarvani karmani, ye tu sarvani karmani, mayi sanyasya matparaha, mayi sanyasya matparaha, ananyenaiva yogena, ananyenaiva yogena, mam dhyayantahu pasate, mam dhyayantahu pasate. Very nice. Okay, back. So we begin now the final chapter of the middle six. Remember, the Bhagavad Gita is broadly divided into 3 groups of 6 chapters. The middle 6 chapters deal primarily with bhakti, as we've discussed before, and we've come today to the final of those 6 chapters. I'd like to go back to the board and review something that we've seen before, and that is a certain flow of topics through these 6 chapters. And we noticed that the chapters began, chapter 8 we said was a little bit outside of the flow, so we left that out. But the other 5 chapters represent a flow of thought, a flow of topic. And notice where that flow begins, not with bhakti. It culminates in bhakti. It begins with knowledge. And that continues in chapter 9. Chapter 7 and 9 are focused on knowing who and what Ishvara, God of the universe, is. Because as we've joked many times, how do you pray to a God who's utterly unknown to you? Now, conventional bhakti, which is clearly not what Sri Krishna is teaching here, conventional bhakti tends to be based on blind faith, andha vishwasa. And it's based usually on stories that we find in the Puranas, stories that represent some particular form of Ishvara, that form of Ishvara engaged in different kinds of activities with a certain imagery, certain symbolism. And to build your devotional life based on that Puranic imagery and symbolism is very common, but clearly that's not what Sri Krishna is teaching here. His approach is remarkably different to that conventional approach to bhakti. So if the conventional approach to bhakti is based on andha vishwasa, blind faith, we can contrast that with Sri Krishna's approach, which is most certainly based on knowledge. Knowledge of Ishvara, leading to knowledge of Ishvara manifest in the world as the sun, as the mountains, as the seas. We saw that in chapter 10. And then manifest in that very special, powerful way that Arjuna witnessed during the Vishwarupa, the revelation of the cosmic form. So that's what we saw ending in last week's chapter, last week's class, Vishwarupa Darshana. But notice all of these deal with knowledge of Ishvara culminating in bhakti. Now, that's not to say that this knowledge, that the knowledge present in all these chapters is somehow dry. When we compare jnanam and bhakti, a common response is, oh, knowledge is so dry, and bhakti is more filled with emotion. Please notice, Sri Krishna's teachings through all of his chapters is full of emotion. Emotions of awe and wonder, recognizing Ishvara as the underlying reality because of which everything exists, where he says, everything exists in me. When Sri Krishna says, the universe exists in me, that statement evokes a particular kind of emotion. It's a statement of knowledge. It's a statement of fact, right? Everything exists in me, he says. It's a statement of fact, but for many people, it evokes emotion, in particular, emotion of awe. And that those emotions then build, as we see, when you see, we had lengthy discussions in chapter 10, when you see some incredible natural scene. You see the high Himalayas, you see the endless sea, and the vastness and wonder and beauty of nature can also help us appreciate better who is Ishvara. Ishvara manifest in nature. Hey, those are emotions. To appreciate the beauty and wonders of nature, emotions. The point I'm making is it's not dry knowledge at all. Knowledge accompanied by these emotions, and certainly in chapter 11, not just the emotion of awe, but we said awe, some crossed the line and became awful, so Arjuna got frightened. Emotion all the way through. So when we come now to chapter 12, we'll see the culmination of this whole process, and we'll see that the result is combination of both knowledge and bhakti. A last comment here before we turn to the chapter is that in modern times, there's a tendency to divide jnanam and bhakti. Jnanam is in one box, one section, and bhakti is kept separate. Like some people, when they eat food, people have different habits. Some people like to keep their food on their plate separate. And I don't know, that's what they do. So in the same way, some people like to keep bhakti and jnanam, knowledge, separate in their minds. That certainly is not Sri Krishna's approach. So as we've observed many times, all of these spiritual practices, all of your spiritual practices, including dhyana, meditation, including karma yoga, all of these are part of one integral spiritual practice. You don't get to pick and choose. That idea of picking and choosing, knowledge for the jnana yoga for the intellectual ones, bhakti yoga for the emotional ones, karma yoga for the active ones. And as my guru used to joke, Raja Yoga, meditation for the useless ones. When you sit and meditate. That idea of picking and choosing is actually quite a modern concept. In the scriptures and commentaries, you don't find a suggestion of picking and choosing. You find instead the emphasis on all of these sadhanas, not just one. Okay, enough introduction. We can continue. Seems okay, but thank you for telling me. I know the computer glitched before, but it seems to be working now. All right. So, with that introduction, let us begin our study of chapter 12. Arjuna vacha, Arjuna vacha, evam satata yuktaye, evam satata yuktaye, bhaktas tvam paryupasate, bhaktas tvam paryupasate, ye chap yaksharam avyaktam, ye chap yaksharam avyaktam, tesham ke yoga vittamaha, tesham ke yoga vittamaha. It's interesting to try to understand why Arjuna asks this particular question. We'll come back to that, see his question, and then see if we understand why is he asking this particular question. He begins by saying to Sri Krishna respectfully, and remember this follows now the Vishvarupa. So Arjuna has been already overwhelmed. Remember he begged, oh please return to your prior form. And finally Arjuna breathed a huge sigh of relief when Sri Krishna returned to his prior form. So immediately after that, Arjuna says, Evam, thus, yea, those who, second line, bhaktaha, those bhaktas, what kind of bhaktas? Satata yuktaha. They are yukta, engaged, satata, continually. Sri Krishna says this several times in this chapter. He talks about bhaktas who are satata, continual. He uses a different expression in a few verses. We'll stay here. Satata yukta, continually engaged, because to Sri Krishna, someone who stands in front of an altar and has tears of devotion, and then finishes his or her prayers and walks out the door, and those tears of emotion dry up. For Sri Krishna, such a person is not a bhakta. You remember my guru's sarcastic reference. He said, if you stand in front of the altar and you have a spasm of devotion which disappears very quickly, that qualifies you as a spasmodic devotee, his term. So, Sri Krishna clearly is ruling out such devotion. He says, Ye bhaktaha, those worshippers who are satata yuktaha, continually engaged. Meaning, worship continues when you leave the altar, and this is such an important point. I was going to talk about it later, we'll talk about it right now. Because seeing Ishvara on the altar is just where it begins. So you stand and face the altar, you see Bhagavan. Wonderful. But then you have to be able to turn around and look at all the other people gathered together in the temple and see they too are forms of Ishvara. If you can only see Ishvara on the altar, you're not there yet. That's not satata yukta. That's not continually engaged. Only when you can perceive Ishvara everywhere, and he's going to talk about that in this very introduction to the chapter, in the early verses of this chapter. He says you have to be able to see Ishvara everywhere. To see Ishvara on the altar, to see Ishvara in other people, to see Ishvara in people you don't like, to see Ishvara in nature's glories, to see nature in nature's terrors. When you can see Ishvara in everything, then you are not a spasmodic devotee, you are satata yukta, continually engaged. So, Arjuna compares those devotees, ye paryupasate tvam, those ye bhaktaha, those worshippers, who paryupasate, who worship tvam, you, that's category 1, and Arjuna here compares them to ye cha api, you have to break the words apart, third line, cha api, and also ye, those who, and you have to bring the verb down from the second line. Those who paryupasate, those who worship whom, third line, aksharam, the immutable, unchanging, avyaktam, unmanifest, formless God. So, first two lines, where Arjuna is comparing those who worship tvam, you, in the form that Arjuna perceives now in the chariot, and Arjuna is now comparing people who worship Sri Krishna as a personal deity, as an Ishta Devata, chosen form of God, comparing those to others, ye cha api, and comparing to others who, parayupasate, worship not Twam, not you, Sri Krishna, those who worship Aksharam, Avyaktam, the formless, immutable, unchanging reality because of which everything exists, that we often refer to with the word Brahman. So here, Arjuna is making a significant contrast based, and now we can answer the question, why actually, let's see his question, then we come back. So Arjuna comparing those two groups, those who worship Sri Krishna as a personal God, comparing it to those who worship the underlying reality because of which everything exists. Arjuna asks, Te Sham, among them, Ke, which are yogavittamaha, which are the greatest, literally knowers of yoga, we just say the greatest yogis. And yogi here in the terms of spiritual aspirant, sadhaka. So who is the greatest spiritual practitioner? Is the greatest one who worships you as a personal deity, or those who worship that avyakta, that unmanifest, formless, underlying reality because of which everything exists? Do you get a sense of why Arjuna might have asked this question? We'll go back to the board. Let me change the screen here. So on the board, in chapter 7 and 9, Sri Krishna described Ishvara as that underlying reality because of which everything exists, that which is formless, that which is transcendent, that in which everything exists. So he, in chapter 7 and 9, Sri Krishna wasn't referring to himself as the individual avatara incarnation of Lord Vishnu. He was referring to himself as Brahman, that underlying formless reality. That was chapter 7 and 9, and things took a very dramatic turn in chapters 10 and especially 11. So Arjuna's question is based on that contrast between how Ishvara is presented in chapters 7 and 9, contrasted with how Ishvara is presented in chapters 10 and 11. Okay, so based on that, Arjuna says, which are the best worshipers? Those who worship you personally, or those who worship that formless God? By the way, give you a sneak preview of the answer, because it's going to take several verses to get the answer. So the question is, which is best? And we've had this important discussion before, and which is best depends on who's asking the question. So here, the questioner is Arjuna. So Arjuna is going to get a response that's meant for him. And the response is, "Oh Arjuna, the one that's best, those who worship me personally, they are best." That's the perfect response for Arjuna. Not necessarily for everyone, as we're going to see. Because what's best depends on the individual person. You've heard me use the metaphor before of if you go into a restaurant and you ask someone, what's the best item on the menu? Well, it depends, right? What's best for one person won't be the same for someone else. That's true in all avenues of life, including spiritual life. Somehow there's a blind spot there. We get the idea of personal differences and personal preferences in all other realms of life. You all wear different dress. You all enjoy different kinds of food, all enjoy different kinds of recreational activities. What kind of music do you like? What kind of movies do you like to watch? Everyone has so many particular preferences. Wouldn't that probably carry over into your spiritual life as well? Of course. And the Hindu tradition is perhaps unique among other religions in focusing and acknowledging those individual preferences. What other religion says you can worship any form of God you want? Every other religion says, hey, you have to worship this form and none other, right? Which religion says you can worship God in any way you want? You can worship at the altar. You need not worship at the altar. You can worship at home. You can worship God with a form, without a form. You can worship through a sacrificial fire. You can worship in nature, in sun, waters, etc. So the point I'm making here is the Hindu tradition seems to have a unique acknowledgement of the individual differences and needs among different followers. We've had this discussion before. I said this is a really important principle in Hinduism that often goes unrecognized. The name for this principle is adhikari bheda. Do you remember that expression? Adhikari bheda. Bheda here means difference. And adhikari here doesn't have to set aside your Hindi meaning, please. In Sanskrit, we're talking about an spiritual aspirant, a spiritual seeker. So there are differences among spiritual seekers. This principle is called adhikari bheda, and this tradition recognizes these individual differences perhaps more than any other religious tradition. And that's so important. And that's also going to be true here with regard to Arjuna's question. Which is best? And the answer, of course, is it depends on who's asking. Just like when you ask what kind of food is best, what kind of music is best. And we'll see that as we go along. So please don't forget that important principle, adhikari bheda, the distinctions or differences among spiritual practitioners. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, Maya Veshamano Ye Mam, Maya Veshamano Ye Mam, Nitya Yukta Upasate, Nitya Yukta Upasate, Shraddhaya Parayo Petaha, Shraddhaya Parayo Petaha, Te me yuktatamamataha, te me yuktatamamataha. Ye, end of the first line, ye mam upasate. Ye, those who, second line, upasate. Those who worship mam, me. Those who worship me. Who are they? Those who worship, who are nitya yukta. We saw satata yukta before, has the same meaning. Nitya yukta, always engaged, not the spasmodic devotee. So those nitya yukta, those who are continually engaged in bhakti, not just at the time of standing in front of an altar, those who mayi avesha manaha. Those who aveshya, having placed their manas, minds, having placed their minds, having fixed their minds, mayi, you have to break the words apart, on me. Those worshippers, having placed their minds on me, those worshippers who are paraya, shraddhaya, third line, upetaha. Those worshippers who are upeta, endowed with shraddhaya, with shraddha, faith, paraya shraddhaya, supremely strong faith. And here faith not in a sense of blind belief, but here faith actually having more the sense of devotion. that emotional connection to Sri Krishna as an individual, personal God. That's what's being taught here. Notice he hasn't taught that in any of the prior chapters. Only here, in the culmination of these 6 middle chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, here he finally comes and lands on this form of bhakti, being supremely devoted, paraya shraddhaya upetaha, being supremely devoted to Sri Krishna himself. He says, what about them? Te, those people, me mataha, in my opinion, those people are yukta tamaha, those are most engaged, yukta tama, the most engaged, the most intense, we can say, the most intense worshippers. So Arjuna's question is, who's best? Those who worship you personally compared to those who worship the formless God, Brahman. And Sri Krishna's answer is unambiguous. Those who are best are those who worship me. Now, is it because Sri Krishna here has a vested interest? Remember, answers are always for a given person. Sri Krishna is answering Arjuna. And what we're going to see is that this answer is given to Arjuna because and Sri Krishna is going to make this point in several verses. I think verse 5, he'll conclude that worshiping formless, unmanifest, the underlying reality because of which everything exists, according to Sri Krishna, that's not just according to Sri Krishna, but just practically speaking, it's more difficult. The reason we have murtis on an altar, it makes it easy for us to recognize Ishvara's presence, but to recognize Ishvara's formless presence is more difficult. And the implication here, Sri Krishna won't say it in words, the implication is Arjuna is not prepared to worship a formless God. Arjuna is not capable of it, as many people are not capable of it. So Sri Krishna will say that it is easier to worship God with form, easier but not necessary. You can worship, as we said, principle of adhikari bheda, you can worship God with form, you can worship God without form, and here we have a unique tradition which empowers you to worship in whatever way makes sense for you. We're going to discuss this as we continue. Let's proceed. Ye tvaksharama nirdeshyam, ye tvaksharama nirdeshyam, avyaktam paryupasate, avyaktam paryupasate, sarvatra gamachintyam cha, sarvatra gamachintyam cha, kutastamachalam dhruvam, kutastamachalam dhruvam. Yea, tu. That word tu is hidden there. Tu, but. Yea, those who, second line, upasate, paryupasate, those who worship what? Avyaktam, that unmanifest, formless God. The one who is, first line, aksharam, that immutable, supreme reality, which is anirdeshyam, indescribable, indescribable. How do you describe, and remember our dream metaphor. So the dreamer is the creator of the dream world. Imagine dream creatures trying to imagine the dreamer. The dreamer suppose it's your dream. You're laying down in your bed dreaming. In your dream are so many people and things. All the people in their dreams, in your dream, are clueless about your life as the dreamer. They don't know that your alarm clock is going to go off in several hours. You're going to wake up and have breakfast and shower and go to work and all of that. What do your dream characters know about your waking life? We use the word transcendent to describe that perspective, that which is beyond your imagination, that which is beyond description, that which is utterly beyond, that is transcendent, and that is what Sri Krishna is referring to here. Too, on the other hand, to contrast, he says in a prior verse, Arjuna says, who's best? Sri Krishna says, those who worship me as a personal deity, they are best, but ye paryupasate, those who worship this immutable, formless, unimaginable God. Continuing, he continues actually this verse and the next verse continues. What is the nature of that God? Third line, sarvatragam, all pervasive. Remember when Arjuna beheld the Vishvarupa, it wasn't just in front of him. Wherever Arjuna looked, he saw that Vishvarupa. If he looked to his side, if he looked behind, if he looked up, if he looked down. And here, this form, and Vishvarupa, of course, had form. Now we're talking about the God who is formless, avyakta, unmanifest. The one who is sarvatragam, all-pervasive. All-pervasive because the world exists within Ishvara. Just as your dream world exists within you, this world exists within Ishvara. And we had a long discussion about this, I think back in chapter 7 or 9. All-pervasive doesn't mean Ishvara fills up the world. We get this wrong idea. Like air fills up this room, or like space fills up this room. That's not correct. It's not that space is in this room. As we've observed before, the room is in space. We get it backwards. It's not that space fills the room. This room exists in space. So when we say Ishvara is all-pervasive, that doesn't mean Ishvara pervades the universe in a conventional sense. What it means is that the universe exists within Ishvara, just like your dream world exists within you. That one is sarvatragam, all-pervasive. Achintyam, he uses another word, unimaginable, beyond your ability to conceive, transcendent. Kutastham, unchanging. The word aksharam has pretty much the same meaning. That which doesn't change. Immutable is a translation people often like. That unchanging, immutable, absolute reality, kutastham, unchanging, achalam, all of these words mean almost the same thing. Achalam, unmoving, dhruvam, fixed. They all mean almost the same thing. By the way, many of you know Dhruv as the pole star. So the reason it's Dhruva as an adjective means unmoving. The pole star is the only star that doesn't move. So here, dhruvam as an adjective, unmoving, that immutable, unmoving God. And Sri Krishna continues this description in the next verse. Sanniyam yendriya gramam, sanniyam yendriya gramam, sarvatra samabuddhayaha, sarvatra samabuddhayaha, te prapnuvanti mam heva, te prapnuvanti mam heva, sarva bhuta hite rataha, sarva bhuta hite rataha. So Sri Krishna now is concluding his contrast. The best devotees are those who worship him as a personal deity, but those who worship that avyakta, unmanifest, achintya, unimaginable, sarvatragam, all-pervasive, kutastam, achalam, dhruvam, unchanging, immutable God. What about that? Those who worship that God, who are they who are worshiping? Those who sanniyamya, those worshippers who, sanniyamya, having controlled indriya gramam, the group of senses. Now, when we think of a group of senses, you ordinarily think sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. You've missed the most important one. We always talk about these 5, but there's number 6. And number 6, of course, is antakarana, the mind. When the term senses always includes the mind, indicates the mind. So controlling your senses and mind, a reference to samadhi, because where and how can you appreciate this formless, immutable, all-pervasive God? You're not going to discover that formless God standing at the altar. Where do you worship that formless God? Not in the temple, not in the altar. Then where? In samadhi. That's what he says here. So, sanniyamya, controlling, indriya gramam, all of the senses and the mind. Those who are sarvatra samabuddhayaha, those who are samabuddhi, who have the same perspective, sarvatra, everywhere. We've already talked about this. If you only see Ishvara in front of you in the altar, you're missing the point entirely. If you can turn around from the altar and look at other people, other things, the entire planet is a manifestation of Ishvara, which means every person is a divine manifestation of Ishvara. The entire planet is a divine manifestation of Ishvara. Those are the devotees that Sri Krishna is talking about here. They are sarvatra samabuddhayaha. They have this perspective. Wherever they look, they see Ishvara. But where do they worship Ishvara? Is in samadhi. That's the first line here. What about them? Te, those, contrasted with those who worship Sri Krishna as an individual. Now he's talking about te, those who worship the formless God. They prapnuvanti mam eva. They prapnuvanti reach mam eva, me alone. So they also reach me. Now, do you see the subtle point Sri Krishna is making here? He's saying that whether you worship me as a personal deity, or whether you worship the formless Brahman, because of which everything exists, it doesn't make any difference because it's one and the same reality. And Sri Krishna so many times in the Bhagavad Gita describes himself not just as an incarnation of Lord Vishnu. He describes himself as Brahman, as that absolute reality, the reality because of which everything exists. He identifies himself in that way, and he does so here. So whether you worship Sri Krishna as an individual or whether you worship that formless God makes no difference. Te, those who worship formless God, te mameva prapnuvanti, they also reach me. They arrive at the same place. Little odd. Imagine driving a car in one direction and driving a car in the opposite direction. Can you arrive at the same place? If you imagine yourself on a round planet, right? So it's not physically possible, we know that, but just symbolically. Imagine one person driving east, the other person driving west on this perfectly round planet. Eventually they reach the same place. So here, that's kind of the idea Sri Krishna uses here. Whether you worship the formless God of the cosmos or whether you worship Sri Krishna as an individual deity, it makes no difference. You arrive at the same reality. Who are those who arrive at the same reality? Those who rataha, those who revel, sarva bhuta hite. They revel in the welfare of all. This is the second or third time Sri Krishna has made this reference in this chapter, just banging it in, so to speak, that if the only place you recognize divinity is at an altar, you don't get it. And isn't that the most stereotypical image of bhakti? Somebody at an altar, hands folded, or maybe doing puja, whatever it is. Let that person turn around and look at others. And let that person continue doing puja. You're doing puja at the altar? Fine. Turn around and do puja to everyone else. Seriously. That's what Sri Krishna is describing here. The real devotee is one who is, he used that word, satata yukta and nitya yukta, always engaged. Always engaged means not just at the altar. It means when you're at home, when you're at work, when you're here at the ashram, everywhere, at all times, continuously. To have this perspective that you are an embodied divinity relating to other embodiments of the same divinity. You are embodied divinity in relationship with other embodied divinities. To have that understanding constantly is what qualifies you as a true devotee, whether you worship the formless God or whether you worship Sri Krishna as an individual, in both cases. Okay, we'll see a little more. Klesho dikaratas tesham, klesho dikaratas tesham, avyakta sakta chetasam, avyakta sakta chetasam, avyakta higatir dukkam, avyakta higatir dukkam, dehavadbhiravapyate, dehavadbhiravapyate. Tesham, end of the first line, for them, for whom avyakta asakta chetasam. For those whose chetas, for those whose minds are asakta, engaged in worship of avyakta, that formless God. So Sri Krishna is still talking about those who, instead of worshiping Sri Krishna as an individual deity, those who worship the formless God, tesham, for them, avyakta asakta chetasam, for those whose minds are devoted to the formless, supreme, transcendent reality. What about them? He says, for them, kleshaha, the difficulty is adhikarataha, is more. The difficulty is more. For those who worship formless God, the worship is equally powerful, but Sri Krishna makes a very important point here. It is more difficult. This is such we're back to this adhikari bheda, recognizing the differences among people. There are so many forms of worship and traditions whose sole purpose is to make meaningful religious activities, to make them more accessible to us. I'll give you an example. Years ago, I did an interesting video which pushes some buttons. And the title of the video was, Do Hindus Really Worship Idols? And that word idol worship is a hot button topic for many Christians and especially for many Muslims. They don't like the sound of that. Oh, you worship. And of course, we've had this discussion. You understand that we don't worship the physical form. We invoke Ishvara's presence in a physical form. We worship the Lord through that physical form. And in that video, I give this nice metaphor. It's like using a telephone. When you're using a telephone, you don't talk to the telephone. You talk through the telephone. And that's quite a nice metaphor for what we call murti puja and mistranslate as idol worship. And it's a mistranslation because you're not worshiping the idol. You're not worshiping the form. It's worship through the form, not of the form, just like with a telephone. But this perspective is not liked by many, especially by our many Muslim friends. So I get these, I always read the comments on the videos, and that video got a lot of comments from Muslims who, in spite of my explanation, by the way, I have no idea, many people, I don't know why, they leave comments before they watch the video. A lot of people do that. In fact, they leave the comment and then they don't bother watching the video because they disagree with the very premise of the video. So I get a lot of comments like that. And you can make out from the username, sometimes you can make out from the usernames that's somebody with an Arabic sounding name, some Muslim sounding name. Anyway, there was one such comment, and a very reasonable person, and he said, why bother? Why not just worship God directly? Makes perfect sense, right? Why bother with an idol on the altar? Why bother with a form? And his question was, why not just worship God directly? You can already answer the question. If your friend is in India, Why bother using a telephone to talk to him? I suppose we should just get on a plane and go there for a 10-minute conversation and then get on another plane and come back, right? Of course you use a phone. It's convenient. It's easy. It's practical. And that's why we have Murti Puja in the Hindu tradition. He asked, why bother? And the answer is, it's convenient. It's easy. Easier to relate to. That's interesting. Even our Muslim friends have something in front of them when they worship. What's in front of them? There's a name for the in the masjid. There's a name for that arch that faces Makkah. I forget what there's some Arabic name for it. Anyway, it's got a name. So you face that particular arch, and by facing that arch, you face Makkah. So even they have something that's in front of them. Why do they face Makkah? Why not face any direction? This is my point. It's helpful for the Muslim to face Makkah. It's helpful for the Hindu who chooses to pray to a deity on an altar. If it's helpful, why should we say, why bother? Why bother with the deity on the altar? Why bother facing Makkah? Why bother with the telephone? It's just a matter of being pragmatic, and we also come back to the central principle of Hinduism, that principle of adhikari bheda. Whatever is helpful for you as an individual, that you can incorporate into your prayer life. Conversely, whatever is not helpful can be left aside. Absolutely. If there are certain deities that don't appeal to you for whatever reason, there's no rule that you have to worship them. So suppose for some reason Ganapati doesn't appeal to you as a deity. There was just a celebration of Ganesha Chaturthi. So if Ganapati doesn't appeal to you, fine. You don't have to go to the temple on Ganesha Chaturthi and offer worship and eat laddus afterwards. There's or not modaka? Modaka. So there's no rule that says you have to do it like this or you have to do it like that. This is that principle of adhikari bheda. Whatever works for you, incorporate that. Whatever doesn't work for you, that's fine. Leave it aside. This is the principle of adhikari bheda. Okay, let's finish this up. So kleshaha adhikarataha. It's more difficult to worship the formless God than God with form, and God with form in this context means Sri Krishna. More difficult doesn't mean, is Sri Krishna saying don't do it? Consider calculus is more difficult than algebra. It's fact. Calculus is more difficult than algebra. Fine, but if no one studied calculus, there are lots of problems, engineering and scientific problems, that can never be solved with algebra. There are so many problems that can only be solved with calculus. So if everyone says, oh, too hard, and no one learns, then we don't solve the difficult problems. For some people can handle calculus. Wonderful. For those people who can handle calculus, they learn really powerful mathematical tools which are incredibly valuable and important. See where this goes? Those who can handle worship of a formless God, wonderful. It's like a shortcut. They don't have to go to the temple. They can just close your eyes, and in samadhi, that's what Sri Krishna says, you close your eyes, and in samadhi you appreciate that underlying reality because of which everything exists. If you can do that, wonderful, extremely powerful. It's a real gift. Not everyone can handle calculus. Certainly not everyone can handle this worship of the formless. Nirguna upasana, it's called. Upasana, worship of nirguna Brahman, of that reality which is formless, which has no qualities. Those who can handle calculus are blessed with a tremendous gift. Those who can truly worship the formless God are blessed with a tremendous gift. But Sri Krishna makes the important observation here, and that is, why is it more difficult? He says in the third line, because gatihi, avyakta gatihi, the gati, the path that reaches the avyakta, the formless God, the path of worshiping the formless is dukkam. It is difficult. Calculus is, as a matter of fact, more difficult than algebra. Doesn't make it defective, doesn't make it less desirable. It is harder. And that's what Sri Krishna admits here, that this path of worshiping the formless is dukkam. It is more difficult for whom? Dehavadbihi, for people who have bodies, for embodied people, for normal people. It is more difficult for them to avyakta avapyate. It is more difficult for the formless God to be reached, avyapyate, to be reached. The path is more difficult to follow. And when we say more difficult, that's not a warning not to do it. It's a recognition of a fact. Worship of the formless God is more difficult, but Sri Krishna doesn't say, don't do it. On the other hand, he is addressing Arjuna. Arjuna, who, in Sri Krishna's estimation, is not ready for this worship of the formless. Notice, I'll just make a concluding comment here. There is so much, not just in Hinduism, in all religions, but especially in the Hindu tradition, so many conventions and traditions and practices which are specifically meant to make things easy. For example, when prasad is given at the end of some puja, do they give something that's really nasty tasting? They give something delightful. So, sugar crystals or some sweet they give you as prasad. They're making things easy for us. They meaning the tradition, all of the great saints and sages who have come before us. There is so much in this tradition that's very inviting and very, what is the word I'm looking for? The effort, inclusive. No one says, you have to do it this way, our way. If you don't do it our way, get out. And sorry, but that's like some religions sound. This is our doctrine, this is our practice, this is a form of God we worship, and you follow this, and if you don't accept this, if you don't follow this, get out. The Hindu tradition couldn't be more different in its inclusivity, by recognizing how different we all are as individuals and by making tremendous effort to offer something for everyone. I'm just smiling. I'll end with this silly story that I tell. I tell this to children. It's just fun way to end the class. I asked the kids, how would it be if you went into a restaurant and on the menu in the restaurant, you saw the items. The items were creamed spinach, sautéed spinach, spinach with onions, spinach. Every item on the menu was spinach. And I asked the kids, would you go to that restaurant? I thought, oh, that would be terrible. The idea of spinach, I don't know, something with kids and spinach. I don't know what that is. Anyway, no, they would never go. But on the other hand, suppose spinach happened to be your favorite food. Then that would be the best restaurant in the world. That restaurant that serves only spinach items represents most of the world's religions. They give you a choice of one, spinach, but if that's your favorite, what could be better? That's a very important recognition. If spinach is your favorite, that restaurant is best. If Jesus Christ is your chosen form of Ishvara, then Christianity is best, without any conflict, we can say. But many people don't like spinach. And the children would all prefer going to parents will sometimes take them to a buffet where there are all those different items, and then the children love to choose. We all love to choose, because we have our individual preferences. But the final point here is Hinduism is more like that buffet that offers all those items, gives you the freedom of choice, but it would be wrong to conclude that a buffet is better than a restaurant that only offers spinach. You can't make that judgment. As I said, if your favorite food is spinach, that restaurant is the best. So, the fact that I've stressed so much this principle of adhikari bheda being unique about Hinduism and acknowledging our individual preferences, that doesn't make it better. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying Hinduism is something great and wonderful and all the other religions are inferior. That's not my point at all. On the other hand, if you're like a normal child, you might not like that spinach restaurant. And if you're like normal people, you might like freedom in your religious and spiritual life. And here we have a tradition that empowers us, gives us that freedom. Okay, enough said. We'll continue our study in the next class. Let me mention, I mentioned last week that I'm very happy that as the pandemic is starting to wind down now, we can now start adding some of our classes that we used to conduct regularly. So starting next Saturday, we're going to resume our guided meditation session. It'll take place on Saturdays at 10 a.m., immediately before this class. So please come at 10 o'clock. By the way, come on time, because there's a brief introduction, and if you come late, you miss the introduction, and then the meditation won't make sense. So please come on time, 10 a.m. And it'll be a brief introduction followed by a guided meditation at 10 o'clock. Then we'll have a 10-minute gap, and then we'll have the Bhagavad Gita class immediately following, as always. So we'll start that next Saturday, and that will become part of our ongoing schedule. I'm really looking forward. There's something very special about meditating as a group. To be here and meditate together, there's something special in that. By the way, I have to share with our friends watching online that these meditation sessions will not be uploaded to YouTube for two reasons. One is a practical one. If you're in the dark, you can't get very good video. But a more important reason is all of the meditations we will be performing are already available in that course in meditation, the inner journey, a course in meditation. All of the meditations that I conduct are all present in that already available course, and they're actually better produced. So if you want to practice further meditation, if you're unable to be physically present here on Saturday mornings, then please go to my YouTube channel, find that course in meditation, and there are dozens and dozens of different kinds of meditation practices that are included in that course, and you can practice at home. Also, I mentioned that we're going to be resuming our Tuesday Vedanta class, and we're going to set that back another week. So it won't be the following Tuesday, it'll be a week. Anyway, next week I will tell you all the details of the Tuesday Vedanta class that will resume. Tomorrow, Sunday, we have our satsang, question answer at 6 p.m. If the weather's nice, we'll sit outside, and we'll conclude today with our prayers at the altar. Got it. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashranvan Utabasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Hamritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.